To members and ministers for topical questions. We're going to move on now, however, to urgent questions. Number one from Rhoda Grant.
To ask the Scottish Government, in light of today's announcement that the UK budget will be published on 11th March, when it expects to publish its own budget.
Cabinet Secretary Derek Mackay.
The UK Government gave no prior notice before announcing their budget date, showing complete disrespect for the Scottish Parliament and our budget process. I received no response to our repeated calls for clarity on the budget date, including the most recent letter to the Chancellor just 2 weeks ago. The UK Government's approach to the Scottish budget is completely unacceptable. The delay of over 4 months since their original planned budget date cannot be blamed on the general election and suggests a total disregard for devolution and a lack of fiscal responsibility. Despite this, we remain focused on introducing a Scottish budget for 2020-21 at the earliest practical opportunity. We'll continue to engage with the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Fiscal Commission over how best to respond to what are exceptional circumstances. Therefore, an announcement on the proposed date for the introduction of the Scottish budget will be made in due course.
Rhoda Grant.
On 22nd December, the Finance Secretary published his letter to the Chancellor in which he wrote it is essential that the Scottish and UK governments cooperate closely in order to enable a Scottish budget to be in place by the beginning of the next financial year. Can the Cabinet Secretary please outline the risks involved because of the timing of this year's UK budget, in particular the risks for local government budgets, as local government provide essential frontline services to our communities, and can he also outline what action he's taking to mitigate those risks?
Secretary.
I think Rhoda Grant asked a very fair question, and in terms of that letter, I just want to confirm to the Chamber that I have had no response from the Chancellor of that letter or the previous letter where I raised some of these issues as well, particularly highlighting the risk to Scotland's public services of the UK budget going later. Of course, my understanding is that the UK budget for the Tories, it was ready in November. They chose not to go ahead. They haven't gone ahead after the general election, and they could go ahead now, but they're choosing, for whatever reason, without explanation, to hold it back until the 11th of March. The 11th of March is a key date, because it's the final date at which councils have to have set their budgets and set their council tax levels. So clearly there are profound consequences in the UK Government delaying the UK budget once again. And without that clarity, even with the clarity of date now, although you believe it when you see it when it comes to Boris Johnson, because Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, told us the budget would be in February and now it's to be in March, we need the detail of the block grant adjustment and the forecasts around the economy to help determine the Scottish budget. And I was able to share with opposition spokespeople some of the risks and scenarios that would be raised if there was such a delay to the UK budget. But I agree with Rhoda Grant, this is disrespectful. This is disrespectful of devolution. The UK Government, I think, know the consequences but don't care about the consequences. It appears to me that the Tory UK Government has given up on the Union altogether and not wanting to make our established processes work. Having wrecked their own processes, they're trying to wreck the Scottish Parliament's processes as well, and we won't let that happen. I just wonder, is this a sign of things to come from the Tory Government? So without that certainty of numbers, we will of course try and work with the UK Government, but it appears they don't want to work with anyone. We'll engage with opposition parties, we'll engage with Parliament, of course the Finance Committee and the Fiscal Commission, to be able to take forward a transparent, orderly, consensual and constructive approach to give Scotland the certainty and confidence that it needs and deserves.
Rhoda Grant.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that response and share many of his concerns. However, he'll be aware that the Scottish Parliament will have very little time to adequately scrutinise the Scottish budget this year because of this. And therefore, I'd like to ask him how he plans to maximise scrutiny and whether he'll publish his current plans for the Scottish budget, as it would be prudent to understand any significant changes at this point in time.
Well, clearly, the traditional process that we were establishing, indeed the most recent agreement that we have with the Parliament, will not be fit for this purpose because of the actions for the UK Government. So we will need an exceptional bespoke process for this year's budget approach. Rather than me set out a plan to do that, of course, I found out, like everyone else, coming to our nation's capital this morning through the news. But I'll engage with the Finance Committee, as I said I would, so that we can set out in partnership a proposed way forward, rather than present it as some sort of fait accompli. This was one of the scenarios, of course, that could have happened. It would have been more helpful if the UK Government had engaged with us to understand their budget timeline process. But I'll work constructively with opposition parties as to process and then, of course, the content. Now, just because the UK Tory party and UK Government has acted irresponsibly, I think it's a duty upon all opposition parties in this Parliament to act responsibly in terms of process so that we can have confidence going forward. So I'll engage with parties on that process and on that timescale. But of course, if there is a truncated period of scrutiny, it's not because of the actions of the Scottish Government, it's because of the actions of this reckless UK Tory Government who have taken us to this position. But clearly, because of the timelines that has been raised by Rhoda Grant, we'll want to give local government and others as much certainty as possible. And I welcome the letter that I've just received from COSLA and local government, who have said that they'd be very happy to meet to discuss the implications of budget timing and what COSLA can do to support an earlier Scottish budget. So I'll engage with COSLA, opposition parties, to make the best of a bad situation brought upon us by the reckless approach of the Tories at a UK level.
Just to inform the Chamber that 6 members wish to ask supplementaries on this issue. So again, I would appeal for brevity. Murdo Fraser, to be followed by Maureen Watt.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Despite all the bluster we've heard from the Cabinet Secretary, I'm sure he's well aware the reason the budget is delayed is we had a general election in December, a general election which the SNP benches in this chamber were calling for. So they can hardly put the blame elsewhere when they were demanding that general election. But more important than the timing of the budget is the question of how the Finance Secretary will spend the money. And given what we know already about the Barnett consequentials coming to Scotland as a result of UK spending plans which have already been announced, Presiding Officer, can the First Minister confirm that he will not this year be cutting the core budgets of local government, unlike the actions he's taken in the past? Even when his own budget has been increasing, he has slashed the budget of local councils. Will he not do that this year?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think Murdo Fraser inadvertently gave me a wee upgrade in the middle of his question there, but just as he's probably not got my title wrong, he's probably got the figures wrong as well. In terms of Boris Johnson, if Boris Johnson can't even get the month of his budget right, how am I expected to believe what he says when it comes to the detailed numbers in the budget? So I want to see the colour of their money. I want to see the detail of what's coming to Scotland. And as Murdo Fraser knows only too well, it's not just the Barnett consequentials, but it will be the UK Government's tax proposition, it will be the economic forecast, it will be the position of the OBR and in Scotland the SFC that determines materially significant numbers that then drives the budget. For many of those factors, we require the UK budget, which is the 11th of March. Now, we understand that date. So we'll look at the detail, we'll engage constructively with parties, we'll come up with the processes as best as it can be in the circumstances. But finally, in relation to the general election, I understand that the UK budget was good to go in November last year. In January of this year, there is no reason the UK Government cannot go ahead with their budget now, especially knowing that it was pretty much good to go then. And the general election, if I remember correctly, was mid-December. The Tories could have got on with it, but for whatever reason, they are somewhat distracted from the day job.
Maureen Watt, to be followed by Patrick Harvey.
The Cabinet Secretary has previously stated that despite having written to the UK Government urging early dialogue, his requests had gone unanswered. Can he update the Chamber on whether he has since received a response and provide a further update on his statement that his officials will continue to work with committee clerks and the Scottish Fiscal Commission on contingency options around the budget process and timetable?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the Chancellor, he never writes, he never calls, he never reaches out. But I can hear the sympathy of the Conservatives members. I can hear the sympathy. But you see, the problem with this is not just about respect for the SNP, who of course won the general election in Scotland. This is about respect to a nation. This is about respect to a nation's parliament and a nation's government. This is about good governance and responsible fiscal policy. And this is about a degree of honour in the established relationships, protocols, custom and practice that we have that the UK government has totally disregarded. So whilst they are showing no interest in working with anyone but themselves, of course, this government will try and reach out, will try and work with the committees of Parliament to ensure that we have an appropriate process and the best numbers that we possibly have to go forward. And I say again, Presiding Officer, it appears to me that the UK Tory party has given up in the Union by not even supporting devolution in its working, and they will pay the price for that disrespect to this country.
Patrick Harvey to be followed by Gordon MacDonald.
It scarcely matters anymore whether this is being done by the UK Conservative Party deliberately to cause chaos or simply because they don't care. The fact that so many Conservative MSPs have been laughing their way through this entire discussion suggests the latter, but the effect is the same. I will once again urge all MSPs from all political parties to bring constructive ideas, constructive and workable ideas to improve the Scottish budget to the table. But if we're going to have any time at all for discussion and to ensure that we do achieve some degree of consensus on what the budgetary choices are, does the Cabinet Secretary accept we're going to have to see, at least in draft form, a budget well before the 11th of March?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, can I say, I think that's a very helpful approach, but actually my door is open to all political parties to have that constructive and workable ideas and solutions and have those discussions. I'll continue to engage on process and, of course, the content of the budget. In terms of the timescales, I've said I want an orderly process. I want one that inspires confidence, that achieves the ambitions set out in the programme for government and allows us to give certainty to our valued public services. And of course there's tax decisions as well, and there is the matter of timing. So although the budget has complexities, such as the Scottish rate resolution must be passed to raise any income tax revenue at all, and it's a huge part of the Scottish budget, or the non-domestic rates resolution has to be passed to raise the necessary non-domestic rates to invest in our local services. There are so many areas of complexity that have to be considered, but I will absolutely have that early engagement. And in terms of the timing, as I say, return to Parliament once we have a decision, having engaged with the Finance Committee. But the important point is to ensure that we have enough confidence to be able to proceed to put us in the strongest possible footing going forward. And it will be for all parties to act responsibly to ensure that this position that we now find ourselves doesn't lead to a precarious position for the budget, because it would be unthinkable if the budget in Scotland wasn't passed, because that would bring about terrible calamity for our public services, communities and people of Scotland. So now is the year. I think like never before we should work together to ensure that we have consensus around the Scottish budget with responsibility following the UK Government's irresponsibility.
Gordon MacDonald to be followed by Willie Rennie.
With the UK budget being delayed until 11th of March, what impact will this have on setting Scottish income tax and thresholds when we don't know the level of the block grant from the Treasury?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, that's part of course, the interrelationship between UK tax rates and the Scottish tax rates in relation to income tax. It has a huge impact in terms of the block grant adjustment and then how much income tax we can actually raise. So it would, of course, have been far better if UK Government had gone first, as per what was expected, and then we could have responded accordingly. But we will look at the options and, as I say, then return to Parliament. But income tax is now a massive part of Scotland's budget, and therefore we take it very seriously.
Willie Rennie to be followed by Tom Arthur.
It's pretty shoddy and out of touch for the UK Government to hold back the budget until March. That is certainly true. It's not the inconvenience to this place that really matters. It's the potential impact on public services that really counts. So will the Scottish Government be proposing a temporary amendment to Section 93 of the Local Government Finance Act of 1992 in order to allow local authorities to set their council tax after the 11th of March?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, that's one of the options, but I said all of this is very complex, and I'm happy to engage with COSLA. As I say, COSLA have just written to me today to suggest a meeting in relation to how they can provide support around UK Government's decision. So I'll engage with local government, see if that's the kind of thing that they want to explore, and one of the options that's certainly on the table.
Tom Arthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As the Cabinet Secretary highlighted, without the UK budget, we do not have clarity on the funding available for public services in Scotland. Would the Cabinet Secretary agree that the UK Government's approach shows not only a complete lack of respect for Scotland, but for all devolved nations, and the potential impact of UK Government decisions on vital devolved public services?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, it certainly does exhibit that disrespect, that failure to communicate and respond. I mean, I sometimes wonder why we engage so intensively with the Chief Secretary to the Treasury and others if this is how they choose to treat us on such important matters. I only hope they learn the lesson from this, that maybe apart from the Conservatives, the rest of Parliament, and possibly even the Conservatives privately, share this concern about how Scotland's devolved arrangements have been treated, how Scotland's public services have been treated, how Scotland's taxpayers have been treated through this shoddy process at the hands of the Chancellor. Oh, by the way, I've been advised that there might be a UK reshuffle in February anyway, so who knows if Sajid Javid will actually be the Chancellor post-reshuffle, and who knows who's delivering the UK budget by the 11th of March. But the point here is they've shown a total lack of respect. They've disregarded devolution, usual custom and practice. And because of the complexities in the budget process, I would have thought in this year, with all the Brexit turmoil that we're going to face as well, that they would have had a more constructive and helpful approach. It's not too late for them to do that, although they've clearly shown no sign of a constructive approach, and we will work through these issues to give Scotland the leadership and competent government that it deserves.
Thank you very much, and that concludes our